Alright guys, today we're going to be making a snake lure, or a fishing lure in the shape of a snake. And I've made one of these in the past, and I posted a video on it, but to be honest with you guys, it just really wasn't that good of a lure, and I know I can do better. So this time around, we're starting with the same wood. We have a 3/4 inch oak dowel chucked up on our lathe, and I'm going to rough it down into a snake shape. If you don't have a lathe, that's perfectly fine. I know a lot of us don't. You can go ahead and grab a 1/2 inch dowel rod and rough it down into a snake shape with a knife or a file or rasp, whatever you can. It might just take a little bit longer. And once we're done using the chisels, we're going to grab some sandpaper, smooth everything out so that we can move on to our next step. Now we're going to take our snake over to the bandsaw, and off camera I made some V's that you can see right here, and I'm going to chop those out with the bandsaw. These are going to be the segments of our snake that'll make it look more fluid and a lot more realistic in the water. And once all the segments have been cut out, I'm going to shape them and refine them with a mixture of some files and a belt sander. After a lot of back and forth on the belt sander and using files, I realized that I needed to make the female ends of the segments a lot wider, and I needed to round out the male ends a little bit more. That way the segments, whenever they rock back and forth, would have the widest range of motion, and that's going to make our snake look a lot more realistic. To lock this snake together, I put a screw eye in each of the male ends of the segments, and I carved out a channel that screw eye could fit into on the female ends. And getting the screw eyes into the segments was kind of difficult, but I found that taking a needle file and filing a little groove in the very center of each segment gave me a spot to start the screw eye, and after that I just screwed it in by hand. If it was tough, I'd use pliers. If not, I would just screw them in with my fingers, and I didn't have any problems with that. To carve the channel that the screw eye would fit in, I took a Dremel bit and carved it out, and I'd test it every once in a while to make sure that the screw eye would fit in there and that they could still move fairly freely, just enough to where they could move around and look kind of like a snake. After repeating that process with each of the segments, I took them over to the drill press and I drilled a little hole that I could slide a pin through, and that pin will go through the little screw eye and attach each segment to the one in front of it. And for the pins, I probably should have used something like stainless steel, but I didn't. I just used coat hangers, and it'll probably rust, but by the time that it does rust, maybe I'll work up the courage to build another one of these lures. Now, while you guys are watching me dry fit this lure, here's a helpful hint. Make sure you number each segment. That's going to save a lot of time and frustration. And whenever you decided to put a pattern on these segments, that's going to ensure that you end up with the pattern that you want. And here's what our lure looks like and sounds like. At this point I was pretty happy with it, but in order to get a lot of action out of this lure in the water, we need to make a tongue, and I chose to make this tongue out of Tic Tac plastic. You really don't want to do this because it's thin and it probably won't last a while, plus you can bend it, but that's what I went with, and it did seem to do the trick temporarily. Now the main mistake I made here was cutting the angle that our tongue would sit in too small or too acute. It was very in line with the lure, so that meant that the lure didn't have a whole lot of action. Ideally, you want to cut that slit very perpendicular to the length of the lure, but I did not do that. So to solve that problem, I ended up heating up the plastic and bending that tongue more downward. Now for the front line tie or eyelet, I took a piece of stainless steel wire and twisted it around a drill bit until it looked like what you're seeing right now. I screwed it into that hole and added some super glue, and I'm very confident with how that will hold. The next step involves sealing the insides of the lure, and by insides I mean the male and female portions. And once I have sealed it and let the glue dry, I put the pin in place. And you really want to make sure that glue is dried, because if it's still a little wet, it can freeze that joint, and then you'll have a very unrealistic looking snake. And I skipped a bunch of steps, but I trimmed off the pins, sanded them down, and then I started wood burning a pattern. What you're looking at now is supposed to be the underside or the belly of the snake. And as for the other side of the snake, the top part, I'm trying to go for like a water moccasin pattern. I didn't feel like painting / didn't feel like buying paint for this project, so I'm going with wood burning, and you'll see how it turned out. It looks kind of like a snake, I think. And here I'm gluing in that front line tie or eyelet, and once I've glued in the eyelet, I'm smearing super glue all over the outside of each segment. I'm being real careful to make sure no glue gets inside the joints, because again, if that happened, it'd freeze up on you and we would have an unrealistic looking lure. And this super glue is going to make the lure a little bit shiny. I don't think that's too big of a deal, but the main thing it's doing is preventing water from getting in there and rotting the wood. I'm attaching treble hooks to the lure in a very similar manner that I made that front line tie or eyelet, whatever you want to call it. I put a treble hook in a wire folded in half, put the free ends in the drill, and spun it a couple times to coil it. And once that was done, I drilled a hole in the lure and glued that wire in place and called it done. Now I also needed to attach some weight to this lure, so I drilled out a small hole and then filled it in with some lead. Then I colored it in with Sharpie, attached a plastic lip to the head of our lure, and took it out to the river. And I was pretty happy with how this lure worked in the water. It wasn't perfect, but going into this, I wasn't expecting it to be. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.